Imagine for a second that you're just walking down Wall Street today. You see the massive facade of the stock exchange, the charging bull statue, the crowds of tourists, people in suits everywhere.
Right, the typical New York financial scene.
Exactly. But now I want you to imagine a literal functioning slave market sitting right in the middle of all of it. Because, in the early 1700s, that wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't just some obscure footnote. It was the actual physical and financial foundation of New York's economy.
Which is wild to think about. I mean, it really forces a complete rewrite of that mental map most of us have of the American North, doesn't it?
Oh, totally.
We're so conditioned to view history as this neatly categorized timeline, where the moral lines are drawn so cleanly along geographic borders.
Right, which is exactly why we are jumping into our source material for today's deep dive. We're looking at the spring 2026 edition of a digital newsletter, and it's newly titled The Marshall Standard.
Yeah, published by the NAACP Portchester Rye branch up in New York.
Yeah. And if you're listening to this and thinking, a local community bulletin, like, why are we spending a whole deep dive analyzing that? Well, stick with us.
Please do.
Because this is honestly a masterclass in how a local civil rights chapter actively takes 85 years of history and essentially wields it as a tool against these incredibly urgent, on-the-ground, modern challenges.
Yeah, and the mission for this deep dive is really to explore exactly that. How does historical legacy translate directly into modern civic action or, environmental justice and community health?
Because you really can't understand the headlines in your own town today without understanding the footnotes from a century ago, or even like 3 centuries ago.
Absolutely. So let's start with the foundation they're building on, right? Which is super evident in the newsletter's brand new name. The branch is actually celebrating its 85th anniversary this year.
That's a huge milestone.
It is. And they've renamed their publication the Marshall Standard. Our sources note this was inspired by a branch member named Melvin Jones.
Okay, so I have to jump in here with a little bit of cynicism because I look at a newsletter rebranding, and my first thought is usually, corporate fluff.
Right.
Like a fresh font, a new logo, maybe a catchy little mission statement. Does a title change actually alter how a community organization operates?
Well, if it were just a marketing rebrand, then no, probably not. But the branch president, James J. Henderson, he frames the Marshall Standard not as a brand, but as a strict operational directive.
Okay, an operational directive.
Yeah. And to really grasp what that means, you have to look at the genesis of this specific branch back in the early 1940s. Its creation was sparked by Thurgood Marshall himself.
And just to be clear for everyone, this was way, way before he was the Supreme Court justice sitting in robes.
Oh, much earlier. He was a young, itinerant lawyer for the NAACP, and he was taking on massive risks. He actually came to the area in 1941 to defend a black man named Joseph Spell in this highly publicized, deeply fraught trial. Yeah, and taking on that seemingly impossible case was a defining moment for the community. It led directly to the branch's formation.
And they also kicked off this 85th anniversary year at the Carver Center, right?
Right.
Which our notes show was founded in 1943 by Robert S. Brown to help working families during World War II.
Exactly. And Brown was a charter member of the NAACP branch, too. So calling it the Marshall Standard is basically a daily reminder to current members.
A reminder of what, exactly?
That they are expected to operate with the exact same level of excellence, integrity, and just raw courage that built these institutions in the 1940s. I mean, they aren't just looking back at history fondly, they are holding themselves accountable to it in real time.
It sets the baseline expectations for every single piece of modern advocacy we're going to talk about today. But what's really fascinating is that while the 1940s served as their sort of organizational catalyst, the branch is digging much, much further back.
Oh, yeah, way back.
Yeah, to expose the uncomfortable hidden history of their own state. So they recently hosted a screening of a documentary called The Hidden History of Slavery in New York. This was at the Rye Free Reading Room, and they had a panel discussion and everything.
The statistics they highlight from that are just mind-bending.
They really are. I mean, by the year 1703, roughly 42% of households in New York City enslaved people.
That is a higher concentration than Boston or Philadelphia. It was second only to Charleston, South Carolina, in the entire country.
Wait, really? Second in the whole country?
Yes. And enslaved Africans didn't just work on rural agricultural farms there, they were the engine of urban commerce. I mean, they literally built the physical infrastructure of the city.
And it kind of ruins that analogy, right? We tend to treat the Mason-Dixon line like this magical moral force field in American history. Like we just assume everything up north was clean.
Right. But this data shows New York's economy was essentially a co-conspirator in the global slave trade.
Exactly. And the newsletter points out that New York's eventual emancipation process was incredibly deliberate. Like we have this myth of a sudden, moral awakening in the North. But the sources show it was a deeply economic calculation.
Because New York passed a gradual emancipation law in 1799.
Right.
And the mechanical reality of that 1799 law is super crucial to understand because it freed absolutely no one immediately.
No one.
No one. It was designed specifically to protect the slaveholders' bottom line. They were trying to extract decades of additional free labor.
God, that's dark.
It is. The law stipulated that children born to enslaved mothers after July 4, 1799 were technically free, but they were legally forced to serve their mothers and slaver as indentured servants.
Meaning they still had to work for free.
Exactly. Men until they were 28 and women until they were 25. So full emancipation in New York didn't actually arrive until 1827.
That is just a staggering delay. And at the same time, the branch highlights a local historian, Dennis Richmond Jr. He's been doing this incredible work uncovering the history of free black families who were actually building wealth in places like Greenwich and Rye long before the Civil War.
There is this complex, rich tapestry of history that just gets completely paved over in the standard curriculum.
It does. But, understanding this hidden history isn't about guilt. I think that's a really important distinction the branch makes.
It's totally about accuracy. Think of it in terms of structural engineering, right? It's like trying to fix a leaning skyscraper by just, repainting the lobby.
Right, you have to look at the bedrock.
Exactly. If you don't acknowledge the 1703 slave economy, you are misdiagnosing the structural load of modern generational poverty. You can't effectively dismantle modern systemic disparities if you misdiagnose how deeply they were embedded in the region's original infrastructure.
You won't understand why wealth gaps exist today or why specific neighborhoods are still marginalized. Which actually brings us to an incredible pivot in their work today.
Yeah, the health initiatives.
Right, because once you establish that economic disadvantage was quite literally coded into the city's DNA centuries ago, you stop looking at modern health disparities as individual failures. You start seeing them as compounding historical interest.
Which perfectly explains why a civil rights newsletter suddenly focuses so heavily on heart disease.
Exactly. Because when you think of the NAACP, you usually think of voting rights or legal battles.
Yeah.
Why are they hosting heart health seminars and handing out groceries?
Well, they hosted this virtual program called Becoming Heart Smart, featuring Dr. Nasolo Teddy. She's the creator of the Heart Smarts program. And they did this in partnership with New York Presbyterian.
And the focus was on heart disease, right?
Yeah, it's the leading cause of death in the U.S. But they specifically focus on how it disproportionately impacts Black communities and Black women, often due to preventable conditions and systemic disparities.
The sources also detail members actively doing hands-on community service. Like they were distributing hundreds of pounds of food with the Feeding Westchester network over at Mount Zion Baptist Church.
It's jarring at first because, like you said, we're conditioned to think of civil rights as purely legislative. Marching, voting, filing lawsuits.
But you can't exactly mount a sustained legal campaign if your community is literally starving or chronically ill.
That is the core synthesis here. Public health is a civil rights issue. The branch understands that access to culturally relevant health education and just basic nutrition, those are foundational to community empowerment.
You cannot fight for political equality if your community is physically ailing from systemic neglect.
Precisely. And the mechanism of how they deliver this health information matters just as much. The source notes the impact of having Dr. Teddy, who is a young, accomplished African-American medical professional, lead the seminar.
It builds immediate trust.
Yeah. Using culturally competent messengers bypasses the systemic barriers and that historical mistrust that keeps a lot of marginalized communities out of the doctor's office in the first place.
And once you secure that baseline physical health, the community actually have the bandwidth to tackle incredibly complex, immediate legal threats.
Which leads us directly into a really sharp, ongoing political battle they are fighting right now.
Yeah, they are navigating this incredibly dense intersection of local municipal policing and federal immigration law. Now, for context, And we just want to impartially lay out the facts as presented in the newsletter. Port Chester is a village of about 31,000 people. And the demographic reality is that the majority of those residents are Hispanic.
Right. And the catalyst for their mobilization here was the story of Milton Garcia. According to the newsletter, Garcia is a 46-year-old father of two with no criminal record.
Okay.
And he was arrested locally for a minor infraction. He was riding his bike on a sidewalk.
Wow, just riding a bike.
Yeah. Yet that local arrest spiraled. It resulted in him being transferred to a federal detention facility, and eventually he was deported to Guatemala, permanently separated from his family.
And the branch didn't just issue, like, a standard press release in response to this. They actually mobilized.
They did.
They built a coalition with local faith leaders. They held a 65-person rally outside a village trustees meeting, and they even secured a direct town hall with Mayor Luis Moreno and Police Chief Christopher Rosabella.
It's a fascinating legal chess match to observe, because they aren't just protesting in the abstract. They are attacking the exact wording of the municipal police manual.
It sounds like the coalition is arguing about jurisdiction. It's almost like a local security guard suddenly deciding to enforce federal tax law. They're asking the village to stay within its local lane.
That's a great way to frame it. The coalition is demanding a highly specific policy distinction. They are asking that local police only honor judicially signed arrest warrants and explicitly refuse to honor administrative ICE detainers.
Let's break down the mechanics of that, because that distinction is literally everything here. So a judicially signed warrant means a judge has actually reviewed evidence.
Right.
They've determined there's probable cause of a crime.
Right. It carries the full weight of the Constitution.
But an administrative ICE detainer is basically just a form. It's a request from a federal agency to a local jail saying, hey, hold this person longer than their local charges require so we have time to come pick them up.
It is an administrative favor. It lacks actual judicial oversight. And the coalition is arguing that fulfilling those federal administrative favors over minor local infractions completely shatters trust between the immigrant community and local law enforcement.
The chilling effect of that is immediate. I mean, if Milton Garcia can be deported over a bicycle ordinance, the mechanical result is that his neighbors will never call the police again.
Exactly.
If they witness a robbery or if there's a domestic violence incident, they stay quiet, out of fear that any interaction with local police could lead to their own family being torn apart.
And the branch is arguing that enforcing these federal detainers actively makes the local streets more dangerous for everyone because the police lose their witnesses. It's a perfect example of how they apply the Marshall Standard in real time.
Right, getting deep in the weeds of municipal law to protect their neighbors.
Yeah, they are showing how civil rights groups operate mechanically on a local level. But while they are fighting those invisible legal threats, the newsletter also dives into literal invisible environmental threats hidden in our everyday lives.
Oh man, the Environmental and Climate Justice Committee section. They are pushing hard for the Beauty Justice Act in Albany. And the data here is genuinely terrifying.
It is. The bill aims to ban harmful chemicals in beauty and personal care products. We're talking about PFAS, formaldehyde, lead.
And for those who might not know, PFAS are essentially forever chemicals. They are synthetic compounds that just don't break down in the environment or in the human body.
And they're linked to cancers and severe hormone disruption.
Yeah. And the sources state that 84% of chemicals detected in hair products marketed specifically to Black women aren't even listed on the labels.
Wait, 84%?
84%, just totally unlisted. It's wild.
And the biological impact of that lack of oversight is highly measurable. African Americans carry nearly twice the level of certain hormone-disrupting chemicals, they're called phthalates, in their bodies compared to white Americans.
And the contrast in global regulations is what really exposes the systemic flaw here. According to the newsletter, Europe bans over 2,400 chemicals in cosmetics. Do you know how many the U.S. bans?
I'm bracing myself.
11. We ban 11.
That is just absurd.
I know.
Yeah.
It is literally harder to get a parking ticket in New York than it is to put a known carcinogen into a bottle of shampoo. It's terrifying that simply buying hair products at the local pharmacy requires you to unwittingly navigate a hazardous material zone.
It really does.
But how does fighting over chemical regulations tie back to the NAACP's core mission?
Well, this is the modern frontier of environmental racism.
Yeah.
The right to a safe physical environment is a civil right. Think about who bears the heaviest burden of these chemicals.
Right.
As the newsletter points out, it's the consumers, yes, but it's also the workers in the beauty industry. Those workers are overwhelmingly women of color and immigrant women who face these concentrated chemical hazards on the job every single day.
And when systemic structures allow toxic products to be aggressively marketed to marginalized communities without regulation, that isn't just a free market oversight. That is a civil rights violation operating under the guise of commerce.
Exactly. And the branch's environmental committee doesn't stop at cosmetics, by the way. They are also taking on what they call dirty data centers in places like Orangetown.
Right, these massive hyperscale tech facilities. They consume incredible amounts of energy and millions of gallons of water just for cooling.
And the historical pattern remains consistent here, too. Heavy polluting, resource-draining infrastructures are almost always proposed and built in neighborhoods that already carry heavy environmental burdens.
It's that same structural engineering flaw we talked about with the 1700s economy, whether it's the physical infrastructure of the colonial slave trade or a 21st century server farm powering our cloud storage. The burden consistently falls on the same communities.
And the branch's response is to demand thorough environmental impact assessments. They want a moratorium on new construction until those communities are actually protected. They're fighting for the most foundational rights imaginable, the right to breathe clean air and drink clean water.
And they aren't just fighting these battles in the present either. They are actively engineering a countermeasure for the future. The sources outline their heavy involvement in the ACTSO program.
Ah, yes, the Afro-Academic, Cultural, Technological, and Scientific Olympics, which is perhaps the most strategic move of all.
How so?
Because by supporting young scholars in sciences and technology, they aren't just reacting to dirty data centers or chemical regulations today. They are actively training the next generation of scientists, engineers, and policymakers.
They are preparing the youth to be the ones eventually sitting at those regulatory tables, changing the FDA rules, and designing sustainable infrastructure.
It's the ultimate example of passing the baton, to finally break that centuries-old cycle of disparity.
It really brings this entire deep dive full circle. Looking at this single digital newsletter, you see just a remarkable synthesis. The NAACP Portchester Rye branch truly embodies the Marshall Standard.
Yeah, absolutely.
They honor 85 years of legacy, not just with galas or passive reflection, but with aggressive action. They are forcing a reckoning with the historical truth of New York's slave economy. They're treating heart health and groceries as the fuel for civic engagement.
Right, and they are deep in the legal weeds, demanding fair local policing to protect immigrant families, and taking on multi-billion-dollar cosmetics industries to secure basic environmental safety, all while training the youth to take over the fight. It really leaves us with a vital concept to consider about our own surroundings. We often view history as something cemented safely in the past, but based on what we've unpacked today, take a hard look at your own hometown.
What invisible histories, whether it's colonial economics, century-old legal battles, or even just the forgotten zoning decisions of a village board 50 years ago, are quietly acting as the bedrock of your neighborhood right now?
How are they shaping the health outcomes, the police policies, and the environmental safety of your street without you even realizing it? Because once you realize history isn't just trapped in a textbook, you start seeing those structural fingerprints everywhere.
You really do. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Marshall Standard. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking for the bedrock beneath the headlines, and we'll see you next time.